Thank you for joining the National Women's Law Center, the Human Rights Campaign, and the National LGBTQ Task Force for today's webinar, Queer Our Taxes, Taxes in the LGBTQ Community. Before we begin today, we'd like to know what information you're hoping to get out of this webinar. We'll be launching a poll question, and we'd love to have a sense of what you're interested in learning more about today. As you answer this poll question, I'll take a moment to introduce our speakers for today. Joining us today are Robin Merrill, Senior Legislative Counsel at the Human Rights Campaign; Megan Morey, the Criminal and Economic Justice Project Director at the National LGBTQ Task Force and a former tax accountant; Amy Matsui, Director of Women in the Courts and Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center; and Amelia Bell, the Income Security and Education Fellow at the National Women's Law Center. Amelia will be moderating the question and answer portion of this webinar. As I get our presentation up and running, I turn the floor over to our first panelist, Robin.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to all of the other panelists for including HRC in this event. I think as tax season approaches, we're now only about, I think, frighteningly 6 or 7 weeks away from deadlines. Folks are really starting to struggle with how to file their taxes now that we are in this new post-marriage world. And so what I'm going to cover first today are some really common filing questions that we get at HRC to walk through those questions. Who qualifies as a dependent, and a couple last thoughts on the impact of getting married on your taxes and on your financial security as a family. So one of the biggest questions that we get seems very basic, but because so often our families don't necessarily follow the norm, it's not necessarily that easy. So for LGBT people and families, the question is, who qualifies as a dependent? So many of us, especially living in states that just got marriage equality or might not necessarily have laws that are as friendly for adoption or fostering, the question of who qualifies as a dependent can be tricky. So we'll also go over who qualifies as a partner or spouse. One of the questions that we get quite a bit is the impact of civil unions and foreign marriages, because those were obviously legal long before the Supreme Court decisions in this country. So first, who qualifies as a dependent? And this is a fairly straightforward test, and unfortunately, as we'll get into a little bit later, it too often leaves LGBT families out. To determine whether you can claim your child as a qualifying child, the IRS provides this 4-step process, and it starts with a relationship test. And this is actually one of the exciting things, if I can say exciting, about the tax code, is that it really is, it's designed to hopefully reflect the economic reality of the American family. It does, too often it does fail us, but the qualifying child test is relatively expansive. In order to qualify, in order to claim a child as a qualifying child, the taxpayer must establish a relationship that can include not only a son or daughter, but can also include a stepchild, a foster child. Also, if you are raising your brother or sister, and that includes half-siblings and step-siblings, and any descendant of any of those people. So if you are raising your niece or nephew. So this is an example of the tax code actually really recognizing non-traditional families. And I would also flag for folks something new with marriage equality is the stepchild function. Up to last year, even if you were not able to marry, but you were still raising your partner's child, that child was not did not qualify as a qualifying child on your taxes. So you are now able to claim your stepchild as a qualifying child. At the end of the year, the child must also be under 19, under 24 if they are a student, or any age if they are permanently or totally disabled. The child must also live with you. This is a residency test for more than half the year. So, and that shows that you can have a split custody arrangement with a second parent or former spouse. Also, the child must not provide more than half of their own support. That's called the support test. And in addition to the qualifying child eligibility, there's also something called a qualifying relative. And this follows a really similar process to that of qualifying child, and it can actually be even more expansive. So the qualifying relative must only be a member of the household or pass a relationship test that is really similar to the test that we just discussed on qualifying child. And what's sort of cool about the qualifying relative test is that it is a little bit more expansive. In addition to children, it includes your parents, your grandparents, step-grandparents, aunts, and uncles. And again, if you are married, this would include your in-laws as well. The person's income cannot exceed $4,000, and the taxpayer must provide more than half of the person's support for the year. So members of a household can include children who you are raising but are not able to legally adopt or form a legal relationship with. I should flag that a spouse can never be a qualifying relative. So as we discussed, even though these definitions and tests are relatively expansive, and for many Americans really does capture what their family looks like, too often the relationship test for determining qualifying child and qualifying relative leaves out LGBT families. So for folks that are unable to adopt a child because of restrictive state laws or have limited access to the legal system, those folks are really left out of the equation. IRIS guidance actually explicitly provides that a girlfriend's child is not considered a qualifying child. And this is the scenario that all same-sex couples were faced with prior to the Windsor decision. And now only couples who do not marry and do not have a legal relationship face this. But it is still an issue, as we recognize that marriage is not always on the table for a lot of folks who maybe for financial reasons or if they fear discrimination at work or at school. So that's definitely a penalty there. So Megan is actually going to walk us through a common scenario.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks y'all for having me as well. I'm excited to be here. So something that I heard a lot when I was a tax preparer were situations where one partner has a child with another person, that couple drifts apart, they're living with someone new, and now they're not quite sure who kind of has a right to claim the kid. So we're going to walk through a situation like that. So in this situation, Anka has a son with Andre. Then Anka and Andre kind of drift apart. They never got married in the first place, so they're both related to their child, but Andre is no longer living with Anka and their son. Their son, Anton, spends most of his time with Anka, but he stays with Andre's mother on a lot of weekends, a bunch of the summer, and sometime during school breaks. Anka eventually falls in love with Kayla, who works full-time as a public defender. And Anka is having trouble finding work that pays enough for her to cover childcare costs, so they live on Kayla's income, plus a few $100s that Andre sends every month to help support Anton. Kayla's income isn't super high, but between her income and the money that Andre sends over for support, Anka, Anton, and Kayla are able to live on that money. Kayla and Anka haven't gotten married, so they're a little bit confused about who claims Anton. They feel like because Kayla's living with Anton and providing a lot of the household support, that she should be able to claim Anton, but they're not quite sure. So they come to you and they say, what's the right thing to do? And the answer is probably, it may not be what you think. So Anka's not working, so there's not really a way for her to claim Anton. She would fit that qualifying child test for Anton, but she's not working, so there's kind of like no point in her filing a return in the first place. Kayla isn't related to Anton, so he can't be her qualifying child. If we think back to those tests that Robin just said for who qualifies as a dependent, the first test under qualifying child is that there has to be one of these legal relationships with the child, so either your son, daughter, stepchild, foster child, or a descendant of those. So because Kayla and Anka aren't married, it's Anton's not her stepchild. She might qualify as a qualifying relative because they lived together for much of the year. But the first test under qualifying child, or qualifying relative, my bad, is that the child can't be a qualifying child of someone else. So we're stepping into questionable territory here. Now for Andre may also be a qualifying relative of Anton. He's got the relationship test all covered because he was Andre's father, and he's spending a few $100s every month on Anton's support. So Andre may actually have a higher, kind of an easier time claiming Anton, even though he's not living with that child all year long. And this is a common situation we see with LGBTQ families that kind of don't fit into that traditional family structure, as Robin was saying at the beginning of the call. So we'd have to look at the support determination between Kayla and Andre, but there's a good chance that Andre, even though he's not living with his son and doesn't see him super often, may still be able to claim the child over Kayla.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan, for walking us through that. We definitely benefit from Megan's past life as a tax preparer. So moving on to, I very much admire it. What does the IRS mean by married? And for purposes of the federal income tax, the IRS recognizes couples if they are married, if they're recognized by the state or the jurisdiction where they celebrated their marriage. And the great news about that is that is now everywhere in the United States. And so with the Windsor decision, it's still it definitely mattered that the IRS did, so with the Obergefell decision, it really expands marriage equality. Now, this includes every state in the United States and foreign nations like Canada. And one of the questions that we get a lot is from folks who were married in Canada in 2008 or so, if they are recognized for marriage purposes for the IRS. And the answer is definitely yes. The IRS does not, however, recognize civil unions or domestic partnerships as marriages for purposes of federal taxes. So that can be an issue for folks, living in maybe California. Although some civil union states did convert those civil unions to marriages. So another common question we get is whether to file married filing jointly or married filing separately. Married filing jointly may produce a lower tax rate, and many deductions and credits, which Megan will walk through, including the Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Dependent Care Credit, are only available if you file jointly. But married filing separately means no legal or financial responsibility for the spouse's tax obligations. And this is sort of a unique financial situation that could result in a lower tax bill. Most folks, though, would file married filing jointly. And lastly, before I kick it over to Megan, I wanted to walk through a couple of things to consider before getting married. I know that we are all very, very excited to be recognized by the federal government and to have access to all of these benefits. But I think that there are a couple of things that must be considered before actually walking down the aisle. And getting married may mean you owe more taxes on the federal and the state level, and this is called the marriage penalty. But in addition to the marriage penalty, getting married may actually impact your eligibility for other tax credits, which Megan is going to cover on the Earned Income Tax Credit. And this happens because when you file, your income with your spouse is combined. So for example, a single mother earning maybe $15,000 or $20,000 a year, filing as an individual would qualify for the earned income tax credit. Even if she were living with an unmarried partner who was making maybe $25,000. Once that couple gets married, that combined income of $40,000 to $45,000 really puts them above the earned income tax credit eligibility and into a higher tax bracket. Getting married may also impact other federal benefits, and this includes Medicaid eligibility, which is determined on the state level. It may impact TANF eligibility because for TANF, you don't necessarily need to be married to be able to claim, to be able to be considered for TANF benefits for if you are living, for example, with a child. But if you are not the child's legal guardian or biological parent, then, and you're not married, then your state may actually penalize you as a household. So that is definitely something to consider. Other things to consider would be Social Security benefits that you're receiving on the record of a former spouse. The Social Security system doesn't necessarily let you pick which benefits you're able to receive. So if you're receiving benefits on an ex-husband or wife, that is something to definitely consider before you get remarried. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Megan.
Thanks again, Robin. And I get to talk about the exciting world of deductions, which is really one of my favorite things. So, so once you've figured out what your filing status is, your kind of next step is to figure out how much of your income you're paying tax on, right? And usually figuring out what income goes onto the return is relatively easy. We pay tax on most of the money that we get from other sources, with a few exceptions like child support or gifts that we receive. It gets a little bit more complicated when we start to think about what we get to deduct from that income that we've earned. So the IRS says that they basically have kind of this standard deduction that they allow us all to take. They say, we know everybody has some expenses. We'll allow everyone to take a little bit off the top of the income that they've earned that they don't have to pay tax on because we recognize that that's going out for expenses. For a single person for 2016, that standard deduction amount is $6,300. So the IRS would let us deduct that from our income right off the bat. Or we can choose to itemize. And itemizing means that we add up a bunch of the costs that we pay out during the year and deduct that from our income instead of that standardized amount that the IRS has laid out for us. And what you're looking at here are some of the most common items that people itemize on their deductions. And keep in mind, we don't just get to decide what items we want to itemize on our deductions. The IRS has little categories of things that they allow you to deduct. And these are a few of them. Mortgage interest and real estate taxes are huge. For most people that own a home, this is what makes it kind of worthwhile for them to itemize instead of taking the standard deduction. But also things like state and local income taxes, charitable contributions you've made throughout the year, some work-related expenses that aren't reimbursed by your job, and then some medical expenses. Medical expenses do get a little bit complicated because the IRS only lets you itemize medical expenses if they exceed 10% of your income, and they only count out-of-pocket expenses. So I had a lot of clients who would come in with a whole shoebox full of co-pays, but even those co-pays didn't add up to 10% of their income, so it still wasn't worth it for them to itemize. But I do want to drill down a little bit on those medical expenses. For some of us, we have big-ticket medical expenses that do make it worth it for us to itemize, especially if we've got some of those other itemizations available for us to claim. And when tax preparers or tax software are asking you if you're going to deduct medical expenses, they often will name some common things that are big ticket for a lot of people. So they'll ask people if they've had a surgery that they had to pay for out of pocket or if they're paying for long-term care. But they don't necessarily ask about things that are a little bit more relevant to the LGBTQ community. And I just wanted to outline some of them here because they're often things that people don't realize that you can deduct. So the biggest one that I feel like is unknown within our community is that you can deduct transition-related care that you pay for out of pocket, including costs for surgery, and that can be really a very expensive item for folks. So for a lot of folks who are transitioning and do choose to get surgery, this can really be a help to them because it can significantly reduce their tax liability. Similarly, HIV and Hep C related care, including uncovered costs of prescriptions. As more people are on Affordable Care Act plans that cover more prescriptions, this is becoming less of a thing, but in the day when health insurance capped out, people who were living with HIV often had really significant medical costs throughout the year. You can also deduct things like reproductive health care, including the cost of an abortion or fertility treatments, substance use care, mental health care, and even things like acupuncture and chiropractic services, which is often a surprise to people. So if you have, if those expenses are a significant piece of your yearly expenses, it may be worth it for you to itemize. And I also wanted to hit on a couple of other really small deductions, but that are always available that you don't have to itemize. They actually come up on a different place on your return. And if we can just pop to the next slide, those are the two most common ones of those are student loan interest. So if you're paying interest, if you're paying on your student loans after graduation, and there's interest that you're paying on those student loans, a deduction may be available to you for that. And also if you're a teacher, there's an educator expense deduction, which we know that many teachers end up paying quite a lot out of pocket. So, so those are available even without itemizing. I just wanted to make that clear to folks that there are a few deductions that we can take even if you take that standard deduction I was talking about earlier. So, okay, all of that was a lot of information, and I want to give you another example so you have a sense of what this looks like. So let me give you another one of these common scenarios. I often had clients come in and say, I just have no idea whether or not I should itemize. I have income of about $35,000. We know that standard deduction for a single person is $6,300. So I would ask them, let's talk about the expenses that you had for the year. And these are just some samples of expenses that a client I had back in the day had, roughly expenses that looked like this. So he identified his trends, and he had just had surgery that year, and he paid quite a lot out of pocket, $7,500. And I should be clear that some of that $7,500 had been fundraised from family members and friends, but even though those gifts had been given to him, it was still an out-of-pocket expense for him. So that did sort of count toward the things that he could itemize. So his out-of-pocket expense was $7,500. Like I said, you have to kind of cut 10% off of that in your itemization, so his deduction for that would only be about $4,000. He then had a bunch of co-pays for doctor's appointments, meds, all that good stuff. He had given about $100 to charity throughout the year. The state income tax on his $35,000 worth of income was $1,750, so that was what was withheld on his W-2. And then he also did acupuncture, and so that was like I think biweekly expense throughout the year, just a small copay. So his total deduction, if we add together all of those numbers, was $6,870. He walked in thinking, oh, I always take the standard deduction. I'm sure I should take the standard deduction again this year. But when we added up all those expenses he had to pay out of pocket throughout the year, it was worth it for him to take those itemized deductions. So we just wanted to highlight how some of these deductions, they're just not the ones that are commonly spoken about in a tax interview or in tax software. But for LGBTQ folks, there may be things that they can claim that people just aren't asking them about. So with that, I will kick it over to Amy to talk a little bit about tax credits.
Thank you, Megan, and thanks again to Robin and Megan both for being part of this webinar. We're really delighted to be participating with you guys and sharing all of this great information. So we've talked a little bit about today kind of walking through the tax return in a way. So we started with filing status with Robin. We talked also about exemptions that you can take and covered deductions. And I'm going to talk about another piece of the puzzle right now, which is tax credits. So tax credits can be something which is incredibly valuable for low and moderate income families and also for some individuals and individuals with kids. So for example, I'm going to go through some of the kind of the big ticket federal credits that families can be eligible for, and that's the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, the Child Tax Credit, the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, and a Premium Tax Credit. So I'm just going to take a minute to give you a little bit of detail about what these credits are intended to do and the kinds of people who are eligible for them. So to start with, the Earned Income Tax Credit is considered to be a wage supplement. And so you have to, as the title suggests, you have to earn some income, but it's meant to kind of help people along the way and encourage them to work. This is a credit that is available to people who don't have children, and it's for people who don't have children, it's not a huge credit, although there's legislation and proposals pending to make it more valuable and also available to more workers. But the EITC is most valuable for people who have children, and the way that it works is more or less roughly the lower your income and the greater the number of children, the more valuable the EITC can be for you. And so at its peak, it can be worth over $6,000 for a family per year. In addition, there's a credit that you get just for having kids. So the child tax credit is worth up to $1,000 per child. And for some families, those who are making at least $3,000 in earned income, but under a particular level, that credit can also be partially refundable. So it's something which is intended to offset the cost that everyone who has kids has to pay, but you don't have to show any particular kind of expense or have a special kind of expense to claim it. In contrast, the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit is a credit that is supposed to help families meet the costs of either child care or care for a disabled dependent so that the adults in the family can go to work. So this is one where you can claim up to $3,000 for one child, up to $6,000 for two or more children or dependents. And this can be anything from a daycare center to someone in your home taking care of a child, or a family daycare home where someone is taking care of 6 or 8 or 10 kids in their house. Or it can also cover the costs of day camp during the summer for people who have kids in school. So those are the kinds of expenses that can be submitted or claimed for the purposes of the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit. It's meant to help people defray the costs of the child or dependent care they need to go to work. And then finally, the Premium Tax Credit was created under Obamacare. And this is a credit where people under a certain level of income, and it's gauged again by the number of kids you have and the number of family members that you have in your house, who get their health insurance through the federal marketplace. This is financial assistance to help them pay for the costs of health care insurance. The credit goes directly to the insurer every month, and then when you file your taxes, there's kind of a settling up where the amount that you estimated that you were going to make during the year is reconciled with what you actually made, and that determines how much assistance you were eligible to get and how much you end up clearing on your tax return. Next slide, please. So this next chart is just a little bit of a cheat sheet. The somewhat complicated thing about these tax credits is that because each of them is aimed at a different purpose, encouraging people with children especially to work, offsetting just the cost of having kids generally, helping with the cost of childcare or helping with the cost of health care insurance, that all of them have slightly different requirements. So for example, there are income limits for the Earned Income Tax Credit, and you'll notice that the column that talks about children uses the term qualifying children. So for most of these credits, even though Robin talked about the difference between claiming a child as a qualifying child or a qualifying relative, you may only be able to claim these credits if you have a qualifying child under the first test. And as she also mentioned, for the EITC, the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, and also the Premium Tax Credit, if you're married, generally you have to file your taxes as married filing jointly. So those are also things that you have to take into consideration. So to go back to where I started, there are also different ages for the kids that are limitations that are different for the dependency exemption or the dependency definition generally. And then the last column helpfully gives you some maximum credit values for what the credit can be worth. Next slide, please. So I also wanted to flag some other tax credits that families might be eligible for. The ones that I went over are generally the most valuable one, and as I'll mention in a minute, they're also the ones that are refundable and can give families a really big boost during tax time. But that being said, there is an adoption tax credit, which is a non-refundable credit that can be used to claim over $13,000 at the maximum for the expenses of adopting a child. So this can include adoption fees, attorney's fees, any travel that's incurred, or court-related costs. But just to note that these expenses can't be claimed if the child that's being adopted is the child of a spouse. So just that's something to flag for folks. And then in addition, there are credits that are available for education-related expenses. The American Opportunity Tax Credit is a partially refundable credit. Lifetime Learning Credit is non-refundable, but it can be used to offset some of the costs of higher education during a particular year. And then I also wanted to flag that many states offer tax credits for families, and some of them actually are kind of state versions of the federal credits, like the EITC and the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit in particular. And then a handful of states also offer their own child tax credit. Next slide, please. So just to kind of step back from the particular kinds of credits, I wanted to situate the discussion a little bit in kind of the tax benefits that we've talked about today. So for example, when we talked about the dependency definition, that is that's used to calculate an exemption, and that is right off the bat an amount which is used to reduce your income. And then as you work your way down the tax form, when Megan was talking about itemizing or standard deductions, that's another way to reduce the amount of income that's used to calculate your taxes. Where the credits play into this is after the taxes have been calculated, because the credits wipe away some of that tax liability. So for example, a non-refundable tax credit like the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit can wipe away up to $2,100 of your tax liability and just kind of take that off the table. If you have a refundable credit like the EITC or the Child Tax Credit, even if you've wiped away all of your tax liability, you can get some of the money back as a refund. And this can just be a great tool for people who are struggling financially, who have a difficult time saving during the year, who've had an emergency come up that they weren't able to prepare for. Sometimes the tax refund is the way that people pay for medical expenses or get caught up on bills, can use for a big ticket item like a down payment on a house even. And although, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, you have all seen tax preparers that are in used car lots, because sometimes this is the only time during the year that a family has enough money to put a down payment down on a car. So it can be an incredibly valuable tool, especially for folks who are having a tough time and need to make ends meet. Next slide, please. So to just review, the credits that are refundable that can help give you this money back at tax time include the Federal Earned Income Tax Credit, the Federal Child Tax Credit, the Federal Premium Tax Credit, that's the one for health insurance, and then 12 state child care credits and 23 state EITCs are also refundable. Next slide. So one question that people often have is, since it's a big chunk of change, is the tax refund that an individual or families get going to mess with different benefits. So, for example, if you get most of the kind of benefits programs ranging from food stamps to TANF or other benefits programs are going to look at your income. For the most part, refunds from federal tax credits can't be used against you when income eligibility for these different programs is examined. You can have the refund in your savings for a period during the year and it won't count against you. So, for example, a child tax credit or earned income tax credit refund can't be used to calculate eligibility for Medicaid, SSI, SNAP, or low-income housing, nor can a child tax credit refund be used to determine the eligibility for TANF benefits. But, because there's always a but, or EITC refunds can be used state by state to determine whether or not to do it, whether the EITC refund can be used to determine eligibility for TANF benefits. But for the most part, the answer is no. Next slide, please. So just to kind of wrap up the tax credit discussion, on a very practical basis, how do you go about claiming tax credits? So the first thing to do is to get armed about the kinds of credits that you might be eligible for. We have information on our website at the National Women's Law Center, which has basically a flyer for every state that says, in this state you can get the federal credits, EITC, child tax credit, child and dependent care tax credit, and here are similar credits that your state offers. You also can go to the IRS's website. It is full of helpful information that can tell you about different tax credits as well, because then when you do your taxes, you can figure out, or at least check out, whether you're eligible to claim them. And, as the fact that we're having an hour-long webinar about different tax benefits that the LGBTQ community can claim as individuals and families might suggest, filing your taxes can be a complicated and daunting proposition. So, fortunately, there are some resources. For example, the IRS sponsors a volunteer income tax assistance program. You may have seen these in communities, in libraries, and churches, and child care centers, where you can sign up and have trained volunteers help you prepare your taxes. And there's usually kind of a lifeline of an IRS staff person to help out with complicated questions. You can find out whether there's a VITA site near you by visiting the IRS's website. You also can, if you're under a certain level of income as well, you may be eligible to get free tax preparation software, which can help you navigate these complicated waters. And then finally, I wanted to flag that that AARP also offers tax assistance, but that targets moderate income families and individuals, but with a not surprising focus on older folks. So when you're getting ready to file your federal or state tax return, you should also know that if you're claiming a number of credits and then if you're itemizing your deductions, there are going to be additional forms and paperwork to do that. So you just kind of need to know and be forewarned about that. And then finally, for people who, again, are lower moderate income, if you have a tax controversy where you are arguing with the IRS about it might be overdue taxes, it might be that you are getting tagged for tax liability which was incurred by a spouse or former spouse that you didn't know about, those are things that you can consult a low-income tax clinic for. And those are also around the country. Sometimes they're in law schools, sometimes they're in just kind of different entities, community legal centers. And so those are also resources that you can consult to help you figure out what your situation is, and they can often help you negotiate with the IRS to make your tax situation or controversy more manageable for you. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Megan, who's going to tie all of these threads together in a neat bow and go through another common scenario.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other thing to what Amy just said. If you're a kind of a moderate income taxpayer and you don't qualify for some of these lower income tax assistance programs, and you feel like you sort of know how to do your own taxes, but you're a little nervous, what I often recommended to clients was try doing it on your own. And if you feel confident to do it on paper, try doing it on paper, and then use one of these tax software programs as a check, because you can usually get to the point where they tell you what your refund should be without paying anything. And so if you've already gotten it correct on paper, there's no need for you to pay that tax return company to do your return if you're already getting it right. So that's kind of another little kind of sneaky way to to check to make sure you're on the right track with your tax return. But just one more common scenario for folks around these tax credits. So I often had clients come in who were talking about how they wanted to build their families. And many, and when I was working in Massachusetts, were considering adoption. But as if you've ever sort of had any interaction with that system, adoption can be really expensive. Just the legal costs alone can be quite expensive for folks. But even more than that, bringing children into your home is just an expensive proposition on its own. So let's say I have clients come in. Their names are Mel and Tasha. They've been thinking about adoption for a long time. We've been talking about it through the years, and they've been waiting on an adoption list for the past year. They finally get a call from Maria, who's the woman at the agency who they've been working with, and Maria says there's a sibling group that's interested in living with Mel and Tosh. They've wanted a family for a really long time, but 3 kids is kind of more than they had financially planned on. But they also kind of feel like who knows how long it's going to be before they're matched with another child. And also Maria happened to mention on the phone that the kids were going to get split up if Mel and Tosh didn't come through, that they didn't have another family who was willing to take more than one child. So my question is, what could we tell them about their tax return that might help them decide? And the answer is, it comes down to that adoption credit that Amy just talked about, along with some of those other child-related credits that we just went through. So the adoption credit in general can help families to cover those legal costs, that expensive legal process of adoption. And in addition, there's also sort of this other neat thing with the adoption credit where if a young person that you're adopting is considered a special needs adoption, then you may be able to claim the credit even if you don't have legal costs to cover. And special needs is kind of defined very differently for the purposes of this credit than you might think. It's anyone that the state feels the state has determined will be more difficult to adopt. So often young folks who are in a sibling group will actually be considered a special needs adoption. So Mel and Tosh might be able to take a tax credit of up to like $13,000 off of their tax liability for these kids, even if they don't have legal expenses that are anywhere near that high. And once you're once you've legally adopted these young folks, they're on your tax return, and you get to claim those other credits like earned income tax credit, child tax credit, dependent care credit, depending on your situation. So instead of looking at this adoption as something that's going to be a huge cost in that first year, the tax return may actually make it financially feasible for Mel and Tosh to claim these kids. So often my job as a tax preparer was to talk about a person or a couple's future tax returns and not just their current situation. So there's definitely ways we can use these tax credits to help build our families and change our financial future. So I think then we were just going to take some questions if folks had any.
So this is just a quick reminder. Well, first of all, I'd actually like to thank our speakers today for a really great presentation. And at this time, to all of our attendees, if you do have a question, please type it into the chat function. And as I mentioned earlier, Amelia will be moderating this part of the webinar.
Thanks, Caitlin. The first question we have relates to medical expenses that can be applied to your deduction. And this question is, does dental care qualify within medical expenses?
It sure does.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Megan.
Shockingly, one of the things that we discovered when I was a tax preparer, you learn the more common expenses, but it felt like every time I went to look something up, it was covered. So dental care does qualify, and again, these things like acupuncture and you know, reproductive health care services, stuff like that you wouldn't necessarily think are deductible are. So definitely, definitely mental care, and I would definitely ask any of these tax assistance folks or your tax preparer to help you walk through what other expenses are deductible there as well.
Thank you. The next question we have relates to, I think, something that Robin touched on briefly, but the tax implications of being in a civil union. So, for example, if you entered into a civil union in Vermont, what does that mean for your taxes?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really depends on whether whether the state that you are in, that you had your civil union in, went ahead and converted those civil unions into marriage. For example, if you're in a civil union in New Jersey, you're able to file as married on your tax return if New Jersey converted those marriages. But if you are actually just in a civil union and your state has not done that conversion, and it is going to vary state to state. I know that Colorado and California and Vermont have different laws. Then you will most likely need to file your taxes on the state level jointly or as in a civil union, and a lot of different states have separate forms for that. But on the federal level, the IRS does not recognize civil unions or domestic partnerships as marriages unless the state has made that conversion.
Thanks, Robin. I have one more that possibly you can answer, or maybe Amy. For people who have been married a couple years but live in Texas, so they couldn't previously file a state tax return as married until this year, can they go back and file an amended return for previous years with a different filing status?
You know, it's definitely going to depend on the state tax laws of Texas. I know that on the federal level, the IRS provided a 3-year look back. So it depends on whether the state provides that amended returns, has an amended returns policy. Most states do. And I think that would be completely available to couples, especially since many amended return policies really can be for any reason. So there's no way that Texas could necessarily block that for same-sex couples. My only advice would be, sort of to echo Megan, is to sort of trick the system a little bit, get on TurboTax or you know, redo those taxes on paper for those 2 to 3 years to make sure that it's going to benefit you. And there might be 1 year it does and 1 year it doesn't, but that's my only caveat. But there should be no problem with that based on the state law.
Thanks. And we just got a question about wanting a little bit more detail about what the marriage penalty means, as what it means for same-sex marriage. So for example, if you were married in 2015 and choose to file separately, will you get a marriage penalty?
It really is going to depend on on your income and on your spouse's income. Whether or not you get a marriage penalty has to do with which tax bracket you would be bumped up to. You know, the tax code sort of, for lack of a better word, rewards folks in almost your traditional maybe housewife or stay-at-home spouse and working full-time other spouse model, meaning that in Megan's first scenario, where one partner worked full-time and one partner sort of did part-time work and didn't earn that much money, if they were married, it's very likely that they would have a marriage bonus. However, for couples whose incomes are fairly similar or equal, there is going to be some level of marriage penalty. It really depends on income, and I'm not sure the impact of filing jointly versus separately? Maybe Megan could chime in.
Wait, I'm muted. Oh, sorry about that.
I was like, Megan. Yeah.
I was talking and then I realized I wasn't talking. So yeah, it does depend. But one thing just I want to make clear from the initial question was, the question was, if you are married and you file separately, is there a penalty? There's almost always a penalty if you file separately, and that's because all of the many deductions and many credits are limited if you file separately. So you definitely need to probably talk that through with someone to make that decision if you think you want to file separately. That said, if I was married, I would file separately because it helps me with my student loans. So there may be other considerations about why you might want to file separately that have nothing to do with your actual tax return. But there is almost always a penalty for folks who are filing separately. If you're filing jointly, Robin's totally right. It's often if two people have very similar incomes that they end up having kind of a penalty for filing together because the tax rates aren't exactly doubled for couples that are filing jointly, and the deductions are a little bit different than exactly double for a couple that's filing jointly.
Thank you. I have one last question, unless other people feel free to keep posting questions through the question function. One of the questions I have is, what should you do if you have a client or if you yourself can't pay the taxes that you owe?
That's a great question, and it comes up a lot because often no one plans to have a huge tax liability at the end of the year. So often it's difficult to pay if you end up with kind of a surprise balance due. The IRS is actually generally pretty reasonable about setting up payment plans with folks. So you can call the IRS and just set up and say, I'm going to pay $100 a month or $50 a month or whatever you can afford to pay. They're usually pretty reasonable about letting you pay over time. There may be interest and penalties involved if you do take a payment plan, but they may also waive those interest and penalties if you call ahead and you're sticking with your payment plan. So it's definitely can be worth it to ask them to set up that payment plan. The other thing is that if you know ahead of time that you're going to have a tax liability, if you're going to owe money at the end of the year, you can also do something called making estimated tax payments, which means you just pay it a little bit at a time the year before, so that you don't end up having that big balance due at the end of the year. There are also there are companies that make loans for people who owe tax money, but often the interest rates on those are quite high, so you're usually better off with the interest that the IRS is going to charge you than with one of those companies. But again, I would consult with some folks locally to make sure that you're making the right choice on that.
Okay, and then one last question that just came in. Somebody has a question that, what happens if you don't have receipts for things you want to itemize? Or do you need to have receipts if you want to itemize deductions?
You should have proof. You don't usually need them at the time of filing. So I, as a tax preparer, will trust you to, if you tell me that you paid for a surgery that costs $7,500, I'm not going to question you on that. But if you ever get audited by the IRS, they do require substantiation of those expenses, so that you have to have something like a receipt or whatever. But also, they will in an audit by the IRS, they'll usually take bank records or anything like that. So if you don't have a receipt, but you do have some other method of showing the expenses that you paid, then that's usually adequate for the IRS's purposes.
And I'll just flag also, sorry to interrupt you, Amelia, but I'll just also flag that if you do claim the child and dependent care tax credits, it's the same situation. You don't have to submit your expenses of how much you paid for child or dependent care, but if you get audited, you're going to need to present that substantiation.
Hi everyone, I hate to jump in. This is Caitlin. It's about 1:58 or 1:59, depending on the clock that you're looking at. So at this time, we are going to sort of start to wrap up, which means I'm going to launch our last poll for this webinar. We just want to get a sense of, how helpful you found this this presentation to be. We can continue to take some questions as we do this, but we want to get your thoughts on how you feel about the webinar, and one or two last little administrative pieces. I just want to thank you all for attending and thank our panelists for presenting. In the next few days, you will receive an email from our webinar program called GoToWebinar. That'll include the materials that were on that resource slide, some other materials from our panelists. It will also include a recording of this webinar, so if you missed any parts, don't worry, you'll be able to get to it. So please feel free to take this webinar poll, and if we do have any last-minute questions, Amelia, we can sort of wrap those little bits up. No, nothing? All right. Well,
yeah, I think we are all good. Thank you, Caitlin.
Wonderful. Okay. So feel free to take the poll, log off. Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.